So that was fabulous. And just a quick follow-up on the youth issue, just to bridge it to the international context. A few staff in the room worked with me on a 3-year initiative called Investing in Young Children Globally. And one of the places we went to study children living in conflict was in Amman, Jordan. And what we learned there was there a group of youth, many of whom live in the very large refugee camp there, refugees from Syria living in Amman, started a group called GEAL 962. GEAL means area code. It's the area code for Amman. And they were engaging youth as sensors in the community. So as Mindy mentioned, youth are everywhere. Youth are in all these institutions. They're visiting parks. They're in the streets. They're hanging out. They're actually great sensors in your community for what's really happening on the ground. So I just wanted to share that and make that international connection. Not to mention, right before I left, I said, we probably don't need to be going to Amman, Jordan to be studying youth living in conflict. We have a lot of that right here. So I also wanted to mention that. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Velma McBride Murry, who was also on the planning committee for this meeting, so she's responsible, along with Antonia and Anna and others. She is the Lewis Autry Betts Chair in Education and Human Development, the Joe B. Wyatt Distinguished University Professor and Professor of Human and Organizational Development in Peabody College at Vanderbilt University. I've known Velma for, oh, yep. Okay, I'm done. I've known Velma for several years now, and she's a great partner in crime for a lot of the social justice and health equity work that we've launched here several years ago. She will be moderating a panel of distinguished experts who've all been involved in very different kinds of movements, as I mentioned in the beginning, that we really want to learn from as we're thinking about this movement on the culture of health. So Michael Curry is the immediate past president of the Boston branch of the NAACP. He was also elected to the National NAACP Board of Directors in 2014 and recently reappointed to the National NAACP's Executive Committee. In addition, he serves as a Legislative Affairs Director and Senior Counsel of Massachusetts League of Community Health Centers, which represents 49 health centers serving over 800,000 patients. I also want to introduce Harper Jean Tobin, who's the Director of Policy at the National Center for Transgender Equality. She also serves as Board Chair for HIPS, HIPS, it's an acronym, an organization dedicated to harm reduction-based services and advocacy for sex workers and drug users in Washington, D.C. She holds degrees in law and social work from Case Western Reserve University and is a Kentucky native. So again, highlighting our geographic diversity as well as backgrounds and disciplines here. Puni Jackson, I saw her come in the room. Oh, there she is. So Puni, I had the pleasure of meeting Puni in Kokua, Kalihi Valley in Hawaii over the summer, one of our community visits. She is a native Hawaiian community leader who directs Aulu Aina, the 100-acre nature preserve in the back of Kalihi Valley on the island of Oahu, where community comes together to create generational abundance through native reforestation, land restoration, food sovereignty, and cultural perpetuation. So I welcome the panel. You're welcome to come up here and have a seat. And Velma will be moderating. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimber. I was delighted, as always, to work with Dr. Bogert. Was on the Board of Children, Youth, and Families when she was physically located here in D.C., so I'm delighted to be here today and just excited about all of the great things that's happening and the way in which the Robert Wood Johnson is merging with NAM to address issues of the culture of poverty, culture of health, which I guess is going to eradicate poverty. And it reminds me of an extension of some work that Dr. Bogert and I did in response to the I Can't Breathe phenomenon. And I contacted Kimber and I said, with all of the social media given to the I Can't Breathe and the increased murdering of African American males, that NAM should be at the forefront of talking about these issues. And all you have to do oftentimes is just mention an idea to Kimber and it evolves. And so she ended up putting on this incredible conference, and that has now emerged into a book that is coming out of NAM on social justice and equity. And the book will be launched in a public forum this spring in the Society for Research on Adolescence. So anytime you give her an idea, it just evolves and it just becomes this really big thing. So I'm delighted to be a partner in crime with her. There are several things that emerged for me from Dr. Fulleylove's talk, and it really moved me back to my childhood. And the thought came to me that social justice and equity and a mindfulness about changing the culture and the way in which we think about who should have access to what happens locally and oftentimes in our home, which is what was illustrated in her talk today. And then it reminded me of the activism that my own parents were involved in, getting my community to become registered voters, because I'm a product of the civil rights era, and having meetings in our homes to socialize the community on what to do when they went to the courthouse to register. And then watching this as a very young child. And now I am just still very attuned to when things aren't happening right, and the importance of having a voice and the role of the community in creating change. So I was delighted when I was appointed to serve as the moderator for this panel that's going to talk about social movements, because it was a reminder of me of the way in which, though we got a lot of attention given to the national presence of Dr. Martin Luther King, a lot of things were happening locally that just never emerged in the public forum. And in fact, there's a new center at the University of Virginia that's being organized or coordinated by Derek Aldridge. And he's telling the stories of teachers who were activists in the social movements along the time that the civil rights era was occurring and trying to get their stories heard. So it's encouraging to know that the movements are still happening. And so my charge, as I've dialogued more than I'm supposed to, but my charge today was to talk about the fact that the movements that we may be experiencing today are really vestiges of what happened in our historical past, but there may be things that are different about the way in which they're doing what they're doing. And so during our conversation over our teleconference, I was talking with this esteemed panel here, and I said that mobilizing can occur formally as well as informally, but they occur around critical issues. Something facilitates people's need to think that they need to bring a group of people together to begin to create change. And so what is it that your particular movement is focusing on, and what are you planning to do, or what do you want to see happen as a consequence of that? And then I continuously reference the historical civil rights movement, where things in our country have truly changed as a consequence of the work of Dr. King, John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, and a lot of those people that were on the front lines telling our country that it's an injustice here, and because it is, we're suffering, and therefore, as Dr. Fulley-Love said earlier, the whole country is suffering. So I informed them that I was going to ask them a set of questions for them to specifically respond to, and they are as follows. What specific issues are being targeted or emphasized in your movement? For example, your movement has been developed to change what? Policy, sense of identity, lifestyle, culture, in response to what is the purpose of the movement? In what ways are the approaches undertaken to facilitate change? Are they anchored in historical social movement times, such as the civil rights movement or the women's movement? Or have you just taken tenets of those movements, but you've added something very new, and so your movement is a new way of doing things? How are you engaging your stakeholders, including efforts to involve youth, because we're talking about this as a community stakeholders investment, which also include youth. And then I wanted them to share 2 take-home messages for us to think about in terms of lesson learned. And then they're going to listen attentively as each presents. And then I'm going to have them dialogue for a few minutes, and then we'll allow whatever time is left for the audience to interact. And we'll start with Attorney Curry.
Thank you. First and foremost, just an honor and a privilege to be here. I want to, and I'd be remiss if I didn't do this, thank my good friend, Dr. Proctor, who serves on the National Board of Directors at the NAACP with me and from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It's funny that the timing of this conversation, I get often asked because I wear so many hats, but the 2 hats that sort of are directly aligned with why we're here today is the role that I play as an advocate for community health centers born out of the civil rights movement, if people didn't know that. And in the role that I play in the civil rights movement, both as a activist on a college campus in Minneapolis, St. Paul, many years ago to the day, to today, where I now serve on the national board of the nation's oldest and largest civil rights organization. And the timing of all this work came as about a year ago, someone invited me to attend the filming of a movie in Boston and said, why don't you take the day off, come out, and they're casting for this film. And Boston's really in this filming boom right now where more and more film companies are coming through and taking advantage of some tax breaks. So I got invited and I go down to participate in this film, and the woman who was doing the casting says, you know what, put on the suit. Because I went in a regular suit. I didn't even, everyone else that are actors came in there, the time period that the film was being made in. And I ended up getting casted to play William Monroe Trotter in the film Birth of a Nation, which was the original film, not the Nate Parker film, but a remake of, a documentary remake of the film, the 1915 film, Birth of a Nation. The film was eventually renamed Birth of a Movement. So I walk in, I get dressed up as William Monroe Trotter, and I had been a student of art history and a student of Trotters as a student, and if you are having the conversation around social movements, it was a piece that I didn't fully understand. And I share this because I think as I answer these questions, it'll go into some of what I'll share. So for instance, as I get casted to play Trotter, it's 1915, the movie, raise your hand if you've ever seen the 1915 film, Birth of a Nation. So I'm gonna leave, most of you have not seen it, I'm gonna leave you with a homework assignment. If you wanna understand American history, you cannot go without seeing America's first blockbuster. D.W. Griffith's, it was a racist propaganda film. Many things that we think now as a country, and you turn on CNN and you watch the protest in Charlottesville and you say, where did that come from? Watch this film and it'll explain it for you. It is that those images of black men and women that we sometimes just think just came out of nowhere. But this was an intentional portrayal of African American people that was done through film. And this propaganda film was released across the country, and Boston became really the birthplace of the movement to stop the film. And Trotter organized, and for people who don't know Trotter's history, Trotter was the founder in 1905, the co-founder of the Niagara Movement, which was the precursor to the NAACP. By 1908, he was involved in the beginnings of the National Negro Committee, which would eventually become the NAACP, and really had rifts with the organizers of the NAACP around really the tone, the strategy, and maybe even the white leadership and involvement within the organization. And Trotter sort of walked away from the early work of the NAACP. But in 1915, he organized with the Boston NAACP to challenge the release of this film. First film shown in the White House, racist film shown in the White House at that time. Mayors across the country were receiving letters of support and protest to not show the films in their cities, but they were often buckling to the film industry, to the money that surrounded this film. And 10,000 plus black folks marched on, and others marched on downtown Boston to shut down that film. So I can tell you it was emotional for me to play Trotter in this film, because I walked down and had to do a few scenes that are emotional. One is the protest that I'm leading thousands of people down the street to shut down the film, the Tremont Theater in downtown Boston. Then there's a scene where we're on a stage like this, and I'm in the audience, and we're challenging Booker T. Washington, who's speaking in Boston, about his sort of conciliatory approach to our struggle. And it basically becomes a riot within that forum in downtown Boston. So there's a lot about this movement that I think is critical for people to understand that this is not new. I often, when I go into, I just went into recently to Boston Latin School, which is the oldest public school in the country, and I split up the group as a group of students, and I said, okay, you're all slaves in the 1800s, and I gave them all a role. I said, Tom, you believe that we're meant to be slaves. Sarah, you believe that God's gonna come save us, we just gotta wait on it. John, you believe we should kill the slave master and take over the plantation. Sarah, you believe that we should steal away in the night and, you know, Harriet Tubman style, make our way up north. And then everyone had a role. And Jackie, you're the snitch, right? You just go back and tell the master everything we talk about. And then I have them engage in a conversation and how much they disagree over what the struggle is and what the strategy should be. I have to encourage you, if you could ever watch that conversation, it would be an eye-opener because that's our history. That part of this work in social movements, you almost never get everyone to agree, right? In fact, the arguing is, maybe even Dr. Proctor and I would recognize, 70% of the work happens before you ever see us in public, right? It's the struggle to figure out what we should do and how we should do it and what the messaging should be and who should be involved and what the partners should be, what the tone of our advocacy should be. That is the work. You know, I think, and I'll do a speed round and answer some of these questions, specifically targeted, emphasize the movement. If I had a drop-down box of the NAACP, no other organization I can think of has the wide range of responsibility that we do. There is not a call that I don't get. If there's housing issues, gentrification, evictions, subprime, you name it, and there's about 40 other I could list, I get those calls. If it's economic development, the lack of opportunity, black businesses or businesses of color that are not being invested in and are getting resources. If it's about displacement within communities, it's about not investing and putting primary business in neighborhoods like Harlem and New York and Detroit. I get those calls. It is the health disparities and it's the disparate treatment in the wake of Institute of Medicine's unequal treatment, that we haven't really caught up to that report to understand that people treat people differently. It's not just about pulling up your pants and not eating pork. That it's also about access and about treatment that delivers for us the inequities and the outcomes in mortality and morbidity rates within our communities. If I were to put it up on the screen, the drop-down box in each of those buckets, it would overwhelm you. And I will tell you, there's not a president across this country that leads a branch that's not getting those same calls, and there's not a national board member that's not getting those same calls. It's overwhelming. And I want to stress that. It's overwhelming. And I think sometimes we're caught in this place where we're sort of siloed and we don't think about how overwhelming it is. But you can't do that when you lead an organization like the NAACP, because there's somebody at your door asking for your help. And sometimes it's life or death. So I say that to say, you know, it's an interesting conversation I'm looking forward to having around what those movements are. If I leave it on anything, I would say the purpose that I think I've gained a position in NAACP is I've been uniquely blessed to really be able to get young people involved. And I would tell people all the time, I think that's become, I come from the housing projects, right? I don't get caught up in this sitting in boardrooms and having conversations and presentations. I will go out on the street and have a conversation with the dude who gets stopped by the police and doesn't understand the importance of the NAACP and doesn't understand what a movement is and what a movement looks like. But they do know that people who look like them are getting shot by police. And they do know that they can't find a job and the unions aren't putting them in their apprentice programs. And they do know that when they look around the neighborhoods, their aunties and uncles are dying of diabetes and cancer at a higher rate and living 5 to 10, 15 years less. They do know that. So when you can go back and you can deliver that message that connects with their lives, that's where the movement starts.
Wow, all right. So, you know, rather than Dr. Fullilove gave us a kind of wonderful kind of case story that illustrated so much. What I kind of want to do in talking about the LGBT movement and specifically the transgender movement is give you more of kind of like a catalog of all the different things that it has taken, to all the different ways of working that it has taken this to get our communities this far. Until relatively recently, of course, LGBT people were outsiders to society and the law. To be one of us was considered both a disease and a crime. And while some of us could, at tremendous psychological cost, hide who we were, LGBT people often grew up without ever knowing, as far as they knew, anybody like them. So coming out risked making you an unemployable pariah, but LGBT people nevertheless found each other, right? First covertly and then increasingly openly. The early LGBT rights movement in the US allied itself with and self-consciously borrowed from, and in some respect, I mean, for a lot of activists, came out of the Black freedom movement, the feminist movement, and other freedom movements of the time, while adding the message that Harvey Milk is known for, which is come out, wherever you are. Harvey Milk was another one of those, many figures who, to get elected to office as an out-gay person had to forge alliances and have a broad cross-cutting platform of what he was for. The devastation and the government neglect of the AIDS community, of the AIDS epidemic, forced our communities to build our own institutions and our own deep support networks. So, for decades, we sought to eliminate laws that criminalized and excluded us and our families and secure the protection of civil rights laws. And that's the thing, that's a lot of the kind of work that I do, the thing that people most associate the LGBT movement with in many ways. But we've done a lot of other things that have been absolutely essential. We worked to build support and recognition within our families, our workplaces, our professional institutions, our faith communities, our denominations, schools and campuses. What were used to be called gay straight alliances are now more often called gender sexuality alliances in schools. Again, teenagers are so important, has been just absolutely tremendous for our movement and our communities. And of course, like Harvey Milk and like the, I think, 8 newly elected state and local transgender office holders across the country elected this week, we've run for office. Thanks, y'all. And 2 of them, incidentally, in the Minneapolis City Council. 2, Black trans activists. One of them unseated the council president. We have created public health campaigns, community centers, clinics, shelters, aging services, harm reduction programs, and even, in some cases, schools, specifically for LGBT people who weren't being welcomed and served elsewhere. And then, knowing that we could never create enough of those to serve everybody, especially if you didn't live in a big city, used those institutions as hubs of expertise to help make mainstream institutions more inclusive. We've insisted that we be counted in major population surveys, and until that happens across the board, we've done the best community-based research that we can. My organization has invested a lot in doing our own national survey of nearly 28,000 transgender people all across the country on a whole host of topics. We essentially had to replicate questions from major population surveys that didn't count us. And it's been tremendously valuable. From a closeted community, we've become one that says, do ask, do tell, including on intake forms and medical records, so long as it's voluntary and confidential. We work hard to make sure that those who don't know us personally have the chance to hear our stories in the public square by training our community members and the supportive family members as spokespeople, and to mobilize ally voices from every kind of profession, every kind of field of science, and every kind of role of public leadership. The progress that we have made is remarkable, unmistakable, and very incomplete. LGBT people are still more likely to experience poverty, unemployment, homelessness, violence, incarceration, substance dependence, some forms of cancer, HIV, depression, anxiety, and suicidality. Progress has come with social and political backlash that has had deep personal costs for some of us. And we know that those disparities continue to affect transgender people and LGBT folks of color the most. But more folks than ever are able to live authentic lives, and we see countless signs of progress. Looking to the future, we continue to have the choice of whether we are a movement that is solely focused on eliminating the ways in which LGBT people have been singled out, or whether we are a movement that is for that is for health and well-being and opportunity for everybody, whether we want to just win marriage equality and non-discrimination laws, or whether we focus on the attitudes towards difference and the economic and social policy choices that perpetuate inequality across many communities. We will have many other choices to make about how we deal with the ways in which we segregate and stereotype based upon gender in our society and the degree to which those things are valuable, are sensible recognitions of the importance of gender in society versus the extent to which they are in fact detrimental to women, trans people, anybody who doesn't fit stereotypes. And there's a lot else that I probably will weave into the conversation, but I think those are some of the key choice points for us going forward. And it became very clear in the last year, if it wasn't clear before, that we have to be an intersectional, a forward-looking movement, a movement that looks to all the sources of inequality across the board, and to all of the things that can promote health, opportunity, well-being, and that's certainly what we try to do.
Aloha. O Puni ko uinoa, no Kalihi mai au, Aina, Avava nani, Aina, o Kaua, ko ilipilipi aloha. Aloha keia ya kakoa pau, no keia Aina, kako na koa kupa a mahope o ka Aina, aloha. Thank you for making space for our ancestral language and for welcoming us in this place, the story of our land. I was so inspired by the talks previous and the panels here. Thank you. Aloha Aina is a movement that talks about loving the land. Aloha means love. Of course, it's being co-opted in tourism. For America, we think of, I don't know, maybe palm trees. They're not really called that. Aloha means love, but love, not just any kind of love, not just hello and goodbye love, love like I will die for it, love like fierce, fierce love, I will protect it. The Aina is my grandmother, my great-grandmother. This land that feeds us, lands, ocean, all that feed us, all of our community, that is Aina. And so aloha Aina, I love, I will protect, I will die for that which feeds us generationally. We talked about how education is difficult for people to conceive of as a health issue. Land seems like we would understand that that would be an obvious connection to health. But when you talk about health, of course, people forget this movement of Aloha Aina. Historically, thank you for welcoming the history of this movement in this discussion. Historically, this call, this kind of activist call, it's in our songs, it's in our plight, started in 1893 when our queen was overthrown by the United States government and Hawaii became an occupied nation, a militarized space, illegally overthrown. And our people said, we would rather eat stones. Aloha Aina, we would rather eat stones than affix the signature of our monarch to a treaty that sold our civil rights. That was our civil rights movement in 1893. And then not even a century later, not even 80 years later, most of us forgot our language. And so when Black Power came to power in America, my parents' generation remembered, oh, Aloha Aina. And Black Power inspired Brown Power. And some of my uncles, some of my parents' generation took back just a little bit, just a few acres here and there, just a little bit of water, just a little bit of our language, just a little bit of our identity, just a little bit of our culture. We took that back in the 1970s. We built a navigating canoe, and maybe you know it, come around the world. And today, my generation, Aloha Aina is a totally different activist. We've a new tool we call a 501c3. It is a very, very powerful tool. And we are taking back health, the health of the land, the memory of our children by teaching them how to be navigators, taking back the land as food, a place for food to feed us, our stories, our chants, our languages. We took that back. And we took that back in a way that has dignity. We were inspired by our uncles, but we used what we learned from our education systems to slide in and take the resources differently, assign them differently. And here we are in this room. I know this is not only our story. And the new generation, this new generation that's coming forward, took Aloha Aina to a whole nother level. Aloha Aina, we love the land. Now it's kapu aloha. Kapu meaning it is sacred, that love, our fierce aloha for Aina is so sacred that the land as our grandmother is sacred. Kapu aloha is protesting even now the building of the TMT observatory on the top of our mountain in Mauna Kea. And our young ones, they take technology and transport in a new level. When Standing Rock calls, the Hawaiians bring prayer. When Mauna Kea calls, the Navajos show up. And so we're on a different level of together, in this together. And for me, I love the idea of ecology. I'm like, do I understand that word differently? But ecology, the Aina, we are in this together. Mahalo.
Very, very, am I on? Very powerful commentary. So now what I'd like for the three of you to do is engage in a dialogue based on what each has said within the context of social movement. And I do want you to make sure you talk about, as our last speaker did, ways in which the young people are being socialized to think about carrying this movement forward. So talk to each other.
Speak among yourselves.
Well, maybe I'll start it off. I think, the interconnection between our movements is so important. And, when you're doing this work, you realize that it's almost like the Verizon commercial, right? You need to turn around and have a whole bunch of people behind you in order to make a difference. And that oftentimes, even within the people you're trying to serve, there's such what we call the weathering effect. Researchers call the weathering effect. The example that I think about is that the researchers use the asthma. When the doctors came and asked the black parents, in this case, to rate their kids' asthma from 1 to 10, and the parents rated, like my mother, rated their asthma 4 or 5. And then the researchers, the doctors, came in behind them and rated them like 8, 9s, and 10s to make the point that they got so used to being in the ER once a month and doing the pump every day and taking the pill that it became their normal, and that we often, in our different struggles and our movements, get used to poor outcomes, poor conditions, bad treatment, and so forth. And I'm often reminded of that from the LGBT perspective of the Fenway Community Health Center in Boston, because I work and I get to advocate on behalf of that health center, one of the 50 in the state. And the work that they did really ahead of the rest of the country to deal with the unique health challenges faced by the communities in Boston that were not being treated, and the stigma that came with that care, and it was not funded the same. It was not treated the same on the federal or the state level or on the local level, and the need for folks to get across their divisions and say, you know what, that's our movement too, and we need to be a part of that. So when what we call our Multicultural AIDS Coalition and other organizations reached out to the NAACP and said, you need to understand that this is a partnership that we have. And we became partners in advocating for bills, for policy changes. And I think there's a need to do more of that. We can get very caught up in our own struggles that we forget about those struggles around us.
I think that's right, and I think that our community health centers are one of the institutions actually that in the LGBT community that in my experience kind of sees those connections and needs for partnerships most keenly. They see how the folks that they treat are not members of just one community, and they're not dealing with just one set of problems, and that there is a common interest in how the health and well-being of their patients are affected by a city failing to invest in housing and deal with the problem of homelessness, or failing to deal with the deep issues with policing in the country. And we don't, I think, talk about that enough as an LGBT movement today. But we observed Pride Month in June because of Stonewall. Stonewall was what, a riot against police repression, and it's and if you look at particularly women's prisons and juvenile detention centers around the country, you will say they are filled with LGBT people, and over very disproportionately, of course, LGBT people of color. We have, I think, a lot of work to do together, and it's not, and often, at the local and the state level, it's happening. It's not necessarily visible in sort of what you see of our movement, but it's some of the most vibrant work that's being done.
Yes, well, this is really hard to do this kind of dialogue. And then, what could I say? Except that in our own culture, interconnectedness is so important, that every gift, every person, every way of being has a function, has a very high function. And the LGBTQ community traditionally in our, I'm talking about traditionally, it's only like 40, 50 years ago, always had this lead position. You go to this auntie for this particular kind of guidance, prayer, dance, always dance, storytelling, genealogy holding. And so your gift is assigned specifically. And so while the culture of health helps us or identifies all of these problems to solve, and then we're overwhelmed. It's too many. What we know is a welcoming space for everyone's gift, everyone's way of being, to lift up how we can each lead one another. To me, that is a very important way that we can say, we're not going to just practice the culture of health. We're going to practice our culture as health. We will see our culture as health. Our culture is health. The mahu, which is our traditional word for all LGBT, have such an important role, but this in the last 40, 50 years, forgotten, put down, reduced. And the interconnectedness, we've lost then this form of storytelling, this form of art and dance. It's put as less. And so not to solve problems and not to diminish the work towards solving our problems, but to also make a space for that story of hope and that story of gift and that story of power. I guess that's what I could add to this discussion.
Maybe, I think, I'd be curious to hear sort of that next generation conversation, and we're having that conversation even in the broader civil rights movement, but particularly in the NAACP. It's always a challenge to me. It's funny when I sit in groups of young people, I say, and it's funny, and Dr. Proctor will appreciate this, I'm young on the NAACP board, and I'm not that young. And that there's a change happening where it's getting younger with more people like Dr. Proctor and I joining the board. But I often tell people my age and down, I said, they don't trust us for a reason. That sometimes we come to the table and we don't know our history, so we're not connecting the dots necessarily. Sometimes we want to blow it up, start over. And blowing it up negates and ignores all the work that's been done to build that history and that struggle, and that, quite frankly, it's about figuring how to change what you have into what makes sense for you with social media and with access to more people with the push of a button, versus saying, okay, we need to get rid of NAACP. And you don't know, you haven't done your homework to understand even the significance of the organization. So we found it a challenge getting young people in the room, but a challenge that we're embracing, to get young people in the room to talk about what is the next phase of this movement, what does it look like, how do we get that old guard to respect and appreciate that young perspective and what you bring to the table, and get you to appreciate that those freedom riders, those folks who got you here, and the role that they play. And I'm curious to hear how both of you are kind of dealing with that as well.
The funny thing about for me as a trans advocate right now is that I feel like everybody is talking about our young people all the time, our teenagers and our children, and of course most of them have parents who are not trans, although some of them, one of our board members is certainly a trans parent of a trans child. One of the most powerful sort of assets that we have as a community is these parents now who are just absolute firebrands, because they're advocating for their kids, right? But they also don't have the personal experience of being a trans person, being part of that. They're not situated in that community, and so their young people need to connect to that community. One of the most amazing things for me has been to go every year to what's I think now going to be called the Philly Trans Wellness Conference every year, because there are tons of parents there, but there are just tons of trans kids meeting each other, and that is really tremendously powerful. I think as organizations, people, media, policymakers will very much listen to the parents, but we need to not exploit that resource so heavily that we lose sight of the voices of the young people themselves, who are really going to tell a lot of us things that we don't already know or have forgotten, even as we need to teach them our history and about Harvey Milk and Sylvia Rivera and Bayard Rustin, and Marsha P. Johnson and and Frank Kameny here in DC, and that we need to pass down to them.
Our engagement of youth starts actually when they're in the OPU, we have a very active native birth practice. And many of our young families are dealing with how to take back their personal health, their family health. And the time when a baby is born is when they're most excited about making changes in their own lives, connecting to land, eating healthier, remembering their stories. For us, our youth then span. We have grade school children who come to the land to learn about watershed responsibility, their role as contributing to their community in making sure that our forest is healthy, that our food systems, when we're talking about this is not a community garden, this is 100 acres of agroforestry and watershed restoration, and fourth graders planting native plants, understanding what this medicinal use is. And then we have quite a big engagement with our teenagers who are just, you're so right, they just know everything. They know everything, but they don't know how to be vulnerable. And that's an important thing that we can create for them, because they know everything, but to give them the space to be able to be vulnerable, to crack open a little bit from the pains that they are witnessing, that they are the most delicate sensors for, and make that healing. I think that's some of the really important and exciting work that we're doing with our young ones. And then it continues on. We're quite involved with the university, and we have bachelor's, master's, and PhD students that are coming, because they have this idea about research, like we're going to research and publish, and the education system wants to put your name on the thing and make you, but actually our ancestors are like, no, make the research really useful. No, it's not, the function of the research is not for your name. It's for the community. It's so that the land can thrive. And so I'm really excited with those young ones who have all the time and excitement and brains and energy, really creating pathways for us to see our relationships differently and to uplift those connections that are going to make a difference for this future generation. They're invested. They have more skin in the game.
Great dialogue amongst the three of you. And so I have a few take-home messages that I got from, am I coming through? That I got from your presentation. One is we started out with an incredible history of the social movement or civil rights movement, and then that was shifted a bit when we heard that actually historical movement began in 1893 in Hawaii, and then we finally began to become much more conscientious of it as they began to connect with the Black Power movement, and then we saw the reclaiming of their history beginning in the 1970s. And so it just shows that while we came into this context thinking that movement really emerged, and we've heard Dr. Martin Luther King's name mentioned several times during the course of the session, it would have been to our advantage to have taken a look at another part of the U.S. where these movements were happening way before the civil rights movement. And so the question might be, how much of what Dr. Martin Luther King did and his really focus on the importance of peace, peaceful demonstration, emerged from a nation that really believes in the value of peace and connectedness. The other two words another word that continuously occurred amongst our panelists is the importance of interconnectivity, and that we don't do any of this in isolation, that it occurs through building coalition, which goes back to some of the comments that Dr. Foley Love made earlier. And the other take-home message for me is that our history is ever with us, that it is yesterday, it is today, and it's going to be tomorrow. And that much of what is happening today is really built on the way in which we're going about trying to create this culture of health, trying to ensure that justice occurs for all people so that none of us experience injustice, that it really is based on the premise of our forefathers. And so we're standing still on their shoulders, even as we're talking about developing a culture of health in our society today. So we're continuously merging and falling back on our historical context to understand and receive guidance on what we should be doing today. Something that really struck me is the way that our panelists so graciously spoke about and demonstrated an ecological model of the way that we talk about the culture of health. And oftentimes we talk about the land as something that just provides food, and because we talk about it in the context of food deserts in various proportions of our community, but it was spoke of as just part of life. It's not just the soil, but it is the life. And a colleague of mine, Linda Burton, wrote several years ago about the importance of home place, such that home place for us is our spirit. And I think that's how it was being described today. And the other important thing about this panelist is linking the fact that the culture of the way in which people think about their life begins at birth. And so how do we begin to socialize our young people at birth to understand the importance of continuing to facilitate those moral values and ways of living that's just beyond trying to make sure that the police isn't killing you, but how do you really begin to internalize who you are and what your cultural heritage is about, whether it's related to being a transgendered person, a person of color, but how do you begin to connect beyond yourself in order to begin to understand how to facilitate a culture of health? And then the last comment that I would make is this notion that one of the panelists mentioned ways in which the next generation is being socialized to begin to own the sense of being responsible to facilitate a level of awareness about the importance of culture and social justice. And what struck me also was that some of the examples that our panelists representing the LGBTQ population, transgendered a target population, some of the same kinds of oppressive actions really filtrate throughout this entire panel in terms of the way in which social injustice is being revealed, and the movement toward increasing social justice and culture of health appears to be reflective similarly across these three panels, regardless of whether it is targeting people of color, transgender individuals, or people who live in the island. And so I end this with saying that much of what we heard is reflective of the past. It's just that the way in which we're framing it may be slightly different, and the real investment in giving voice to all parties involved, particularly trying to find a way to bring the young and the old together so that there's voice and respect for each around the table as we're talking about these movements, is really important. So I really, really enjoyed being part of this panel today as a way of reacting to some of the comments from Dr. Fullilove, and I say, keep up the good works. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask you to stay there because Ivory's going to do a poll everywhere to engage our online audience, but we have 10 minutes. She can do that while you take some questions from the room. Is that okay with everyone? Okay.
Yeah, so, and Derek, could you just flip our screen for us for the poll everywhere? So you're welcome, as Kimber said, to participate in the poll everywhere, and then we'll also do the questions in the room.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Excellent. Thank you so much. That was an incredible panel. I wanted to ask a follow-up question based on what you said about just the problems being overwhelming.
Yes.
And I think that that is something that I think about a lot when we start talking about the social determinants of health and how everything's interconnected, and we want to solve all the problems because they truly are interconnected, and you can't give someone drugs for their HIV if they don't have a home to put them in,
Yes.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it keeps kind of cascading down. And then we get into these beautiful settings where everyone's talking about each other's populations and it's so lovely. And then we get a grant for, $500,000 that has very specific guidelines, and we have a mission and we can't have mission drift. And so I'm wondering if you can each kind of touch upon, solutions that you have when you have a mission and a population and whatever you're trying to do, and you can build coalition, but no matter what you say or want to do, we can't all do everything. So I would love to just hear a little bit from you.
Who was it that said, it was our keynote talked about how we love logic models and frameworks. I work for a federally qualified health center in the forest of Kalihi, if you can just, that's social determinants right there. But there's a framework that we use called the 4 Connections Framework. And so this, it's an evaluation framework, but what we're focusing on is the connections. And so connections to self, connections to place, connection to past, present, and future, and then connections to others. And so this sense of isolation is how we have, and actually the framework came from listening to stories of our patients and our community. And it was the same thing when you say, talk to us of health. Nobody said, when I'm in my doctor's office and I get a shot, I feel real healthy. People talked about like when my grandfather fishes, so we were talking about what are those stories of health, and then looking at uplifting those elements that we're going to find those connections that made the human health, the community health whole. And so that then are those connections. it doesn't address everything. Everything is still there. You still have to face the woman who was beaten and help her get to the service so that she can be safe. You still have to go, but then somehow her story is different if you are thinking about, and everyone on your staff or everyone in your community is aware and values all of the interconnectedness of her story as a whole, because she is part of this whole community. So that's what we learned from our community and made into a logic model framework, and are trying to evaluate and move forward. But what I love about that particular approach is that it allows us to stay in the human space, the story as a whole.
I guess two thoughts that come to mind on that, which is one, certainly as a political activist, sometimes you have the thing, you have the division of labor where, I am in charge of, among all the people that I work with, conceiving the strategy for how we're going to get trans people accurate ID documents. Whatever, and that means I'm in charge of that, and I'm in charge of telling everybody else who doesn't work on that full time where and how they can strategically show up with the resources that they have to help at critical moments. And I'm in charge of listening to my colleagues when they are doing the same for me, right, on other issues. But I think also programmatically, you can't sort of pull everything that every social determinant of health you want to do into your grant. But you can try to think about what are the key ways you can have an increase impact by broadening the frame a little bit. So, for example, if you're trying to connect vulnerable folks, with a medical home for their HIV care, you can't maybe, tackle homelessness and incarceration and everything in that grant, but one, bite-sized thing that you can do is say, actually, if one of our target populations is trans people, we can think a little bit broader, and we can say, this medical home has to provide their hormone care, because that is going to help make sure that they get here and stay here and feel welcome here and feel like it's absolutely critical for them day in and day out to keep showing up. And so there are ways we can just broaden the frame a little bit, and if we all can do that a little bit in a bunch of other places, we will actually move pretty far forward.
And the only thing I would add to that is I'm often reflecting on a conversation I had with Jack Geiger, one of the founders of the Health Center movement, and he is now getting up in age. I think he's in his mid-80s now. And I had an opportunity with him a few years ago to sit in Chicago and talk about why he and Count Gibson and so many others across the country in 1965, the early 1960s, started to think about the civil rights movement and the work in the healthcare space. And what he said to me, he said, Michael, it was never just about health. That was really about, if we were in Columbia Point in Dorchester, Massachusetts, or in Mount Bayou, Mississippi, it was about economic development, it was about education, it was about black at that time professionals in the medical field, like Dr. Green in Mississippi, organizing doctors to get together to figure out a pipeline of black clinicians, that it was always about all of that. And I think to that point about how overwhelming it is, that they understood that, but they understood they couldn't do it all. That you needed to connect with the black clinicians to say, hey, you need to be a part of this movement, and use the health center movement as a vehicle to do that. You need to connect with the folks who are doing economic development and farming and growing the farming industry and trying to make sure black farmers had a place at the table. I think we have the same challenge, that oftentimes we're thinking that we need to do everything, and we load up in the grant. And for any of us who had to write a grant, you sort of put everything in the kitchen sink in it, and you want to do all that, but you can't. And the reality is, you got to trust that there are other people in other spaces that if you collaborate with, you partner with, co-write the grant with, and include them, it gives you an opportunity to have the maximum impact in the communities that you serve. And it's a challenge. I think for us in Massachusetts, and particularly in Boston, there are other opportunities. So I think about, I serve on a commission, a group, a task force that is distributing $53 million of children's hospital money. Basically, they're building a new building, and a certain percentage of the money to build that building has to go to the community. And it looks at what the needs are of that community. And a group of us sit around the table and say, okay, what's the need? And where are the spaces where we could use some infusion of money that will make the maximum impact in food deserts, or in public safety, or in behavioral health, the opioid addiction, and quite frankly, people forgot about the other abuses, the addictions, substance use addictions before the opioid crisis. We have that conversation, and it's filling in the gaps of the work we're doing in NAACP and the Urban League and all these other spaces. So sometimes you got to get at the other tables and figure out how it can complement the work that you're doing.
So we'll go ahead and make this our last question. So go ahead, sir.
Thank you. And thank you for your words. It's very inspiring. I have a comment and a question. My comment being that I work at the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative over in Boston. And if you're considering incorporating youth voice into your institutional decision making, we would recommend looking at your board structure. We've built equity directly into our board structure with 4 seats for young people, 4 seats for African Americans, 4 for Cape Verdeans, 4 for Latinx, and 4 for white residents. So that's something to consider. My question, so among organizers here on the panel, you're in a room with academics and scientists and researchers, and reflecting on your comment, Puni, about creating spaces to share stories of hope. I know in Roxbury, North Dorchester, among the crises of poverty, those opportunities are few and far between. But given that you're in this diverse room, I was hoping you might reflect on ways that people who wouldn't traditionally consider themselves to be organizers, how they identify opportunities in their daily lives to do organizing for movement building like this.
A great question. We have a term in our community that actually my son coined when he was a tiny one. He called us super aunties. I was putting on I'm not wearing heels today, putting on heels, and I don't often wear heels. And he said, I tried them on, and he said, I am a super auntie. And so when you're talking about organizing in people who don't see themselves as organizing in a community setting, sometimes it's really about how we already have relationship, and then also recognizing what knowledge or resource, not necessarily capital resource, that an organizer might have. So maybe that might be space. Maybe somebody's really good at cooking. Maybe somebody, has access to canoes and we have to go to another island, or, all of these different things. And then for us, then the reflecting back of that, mahalo is one of our it's an important word for us, mahalo. It means thank you, it means reverence, it means admiration and respect. And so always we finish our gatherings with this opportunity to say mahalo, and specifically what you are grateful for. Then that gives then the community an opportunity to reflect back on those that maybe didn't see themselves as leaders or playing an important role in a particular gathering, but the listening is built into the culture of gathering. And then you're able to reflect again and again, and then see which gifts are sort of bubbling up to the surface it takes time, over time. And then you call on those aunties again and again. And we have super uncles, of course, too.
Maybe it's interesting. I'm a huge fan of Dia Sinai and the work that you do. And I would be curious if even a quarter of this room even knows what a Cape Verdean is. Because you go across the country, people don't know what a Cape Verdean is. It's interesting. I think, part of it is, and I think a broader view of what a leader is. Even we had in Boston a student movement recently with folks who were not happy with the Boston Public Schools, and many of them, I saw them on the street who had never spoken publicly in their lives, and all of a sudden they're giving a speech to like 300-400 other kids. That I think it's in us, but giving them the opportunity to be in spaces and places where they can let that live out, and that it's also broad. It's bringing the paperwork, it's doing the research, it's helping with the talking points. It's not just the person you see. And in the years I was in the NAACP as president of a branch, I can tell you most of the work was not done by me. That there were many people with me who were doing that work, and that young people, I try to relay that message all the time. I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, because I think it's one of the most powerful things I share with people, with young people in particular, which is I say that old saying that if you're not old, I don't know how old it is, but they say that if you're not at the table, you're on the table or you're on the menu. And that as young people, they have to be at the table And at the table has a lot of different manifestations. It means you got to show up and vote when you turn of age. It means that you need to be at the school committee meeting, the DSNI board meeting, the health center board meeting, that you need to be in all those rooms that they're talking about your community, your services, your needs. And if you're not there, don't be shocked if the budget doesn't reflect the needs that you have. Don't be shocked if the school closes in your neighborhood, if the health center closes in your neighborhood, or if the budget cut eliminates dental care and Medicaid, right? That they need to understand that they have the opportunity to influence so many things if they organize. And once you share that with young people, I get the impression from my years of doing this, they get excited about it. That they now see what their niche is and the role that they can play. And I think, you know, DSNI is a great example. You're already doing that with young people. And Liz Moran is, I'm a huge fan of Liz, and you know Liz.
My colleagues have really said it, so I'm going to leave it there.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank our speakers again for... And just before we break, I will read a few. We had some great movements that were represented on the stage, but I wanted to read a few of the ones that came through on Poll Everywhere for folks. So the Black Lives Matter movement, the United Farm Workers movement, the DACA Dreamers movement, tobacco control, access to health care, feminism, Promotora's March On, and the Poor People's Council, and also health insurance coverage. So I think this conversation really sparked some thought for folks both in the room and on our webcast, and we're very appreciative of that. So I'll do some housekeeping. As you can see from your agenda, up next is lunch. And so lunch is going to be available in room 101, which is again just to the hallway, out the doors, down the hallway to the right, and the room is on the left. But that all-important question of where are the bathrooms located. So there are bathrooms on this floor, and there are also bathrooms available on the second floor. So if you go up the stairs and then you go straight and turn to the right, there are bathrooms available there. So please feel free to spend the next 25 minutes grabbing your lunch, doing some networking, and we will come to call you back into the room. But feel free to also bring your lunch in here and eat. You don't just have to stay in room 101. So thank you all.
Thank you.